Anna-Liza, I'm going to start with you, if you don't mind. And so as to not be too repetitive for the faces who've been here earlier, could you speak a little bit about what environmental toxins are, and particularly how they affect the physiological and psychological body?
Well, that's a big question.
Just speak a little bit about it.
Yeah, just a little bit, right? Well, let's see how far we get here. So I think when we talk about toxin, I want to back up a little bit and go back to a word chemical, even before we talk about toxin. So, when we talk about chemicals, we need to realize that almost everything, pretty much everything, has like a chemical composition, right? By which I mean you can look at, something like dihydrogen, oxide, which I think is what water would be, right? And you can say, well, that's a chemical, it's just water. And I think we just need to remember that when we're looking at labels, when we're thinking of chemicals, it's not like all chemicals are bad, right? It's just everything has an actual chemical structure. But when we're talking about toxins, what we're talking about are things that are actually not natural and things that have been concocted, so to speak, and put together in ways that, frankly, our body doesn't really recognize. So when it comes down to the health impacts, then this is really where they're coming from. So we need to remember that if we go back to further back in our evolutionary history, what's happening here is that our world has changed so very, very much in terms of the toxins that we are constantly bombarded with. For those of you that attended the first panel, we talked a little bit about, well, where in your life are you actually encountering these toxins? And the answer is virtually everywhere. So they are here, and we need to remember that they work in our systems in a way that's really deep, and they work in ways that don't just impact like one aspect. Because when we talk about things like endocrine disruptors, which is often what we're talking about with environmental toxins, the endocrine system just means how our hormones are operating, right? Hormones are essentially ruling our lives, for every minute of the day. And when something happens, i.e., interesting chemical compound that is not natural, that our bodies don't really know what to do with, it comes in there, and the endocrine system is something that's really impacted. And hormones do everything. Let's be clear about that. It can affect everything from your fertility status, as males or females, or any gender expansive person, by the way. It can affect everything from your mood. It can get to much more serious and chronic health conditions, such as diabetes, such as cancer, such as various things. And the thing that's really interesting about this is that, when it comes to the endocrine system, there's almost no limit to what these things can do. And they don't always work quickly. And that's why sometimes when it comes to how does it affect our health, that question isn't always that easy to answer, because we know that some chemicals, some things, have what we call acute impacts. We're going to intake, and then we're going to see pretty quickly what the impact of that is. But with these chemicals, they don't necessarily work that way. There's what we call cumulative effects, meaning even at pretty low levels, we can take in these chemicals, and over time, they are going to build up in our fat tissues mostly. They're going to build up, they're going to be impacting us. And this is why the studies, they're not really where they need to be, because it takes a long time to measure cumulative impact. And some companies, in some industries, they're just not willing to wait that long, right? They want to get this stuff out there, whether it's healthy or not, as quickly as possible. So we need to be very aware of the fact that we're encountering these in many aspects of our lives, that they're impacting our hormones, which has a very, very wide range of impacts that's both acute and both chronic. And also, I'll just finish off by saying that these impacts can be intergenerational. We know that, as you mentioned, trauma can be intergenerational, but so can these impacts, these endocrine impacts that we're talking about. So I guess we can start it off there.
Thank you.
And shall I?
If anybody else has anything to add, please. Yes.
I have one more piece, Dan.
Yes.
The other thing about these chemicals is they have a synergistic effect together. So the studies are usually only done on one chemical by itself, but it's an exponential magnification when you have 3 or 4 chemicals together in terms of the hormonal effects, particularly the estrogenic effects, and those studies haven't been done. And so we're not seeing in the research the immense effect of these chemicals on human health. And they have traced them in animal studies to see that they put a tag on a chemical and follow it through several generations. 3 generations later, that chemical is still in the body of the offspring. So every generation has a bigger and bigger environmental load of these hormone disrupting chemicals, And the only way to turn that around is for fertile couples to detoxify, actually, before they get pregnant. And it's possible to do that. So, yeah.
Thank you. Dharam, I would like to ask you about what gap you noticed in the realm of women's health and environmental health, and why you started the Mamma-Life Foundation. And for those of you who don't know, maybe explain a bit about what the foundation is and the Healthy Breast Program.
Thank you. So when I was in my third year as a naturopathic student, this would be 1988, 87, 88, I became pregnant with my daughter. And at the same time, a friend of mine was diagnosed with breast cancer. And she asked me for, what can I do? And I started to look at, well, what is there out there naturopathically for women with breast cancer? And there was very little at the time. So I thought, this doesn't make sense. How come? And I started to put together packages of information. What are the environmental links? What should she eat? What nutritional supplements should she take? What are the psychological factors related to breast cancer? What are the lifestyle factors we can do? What are the hormonal factors? And as I started to integrate that information, I recognized for the first time the huge impact of the environment. I had no idea that parabens and phthalates and organochlorines and pesticides and heavy metals had estrogenic effects that could trigger breast cancer. And when I found that out, a few things happened. One, I became terrifically angry, enraged, that this was happening and nobody was talking about it, and how is this possible? I couldn't believe it was possible, and that the industries were creating this and not telling us what was happening. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and I realized the impact of that, not only in women now, 3 million women a year at least are diagnosed with breast cancer globally, 3 million a year. But also, at that time, it was 1 in 9 women were going to be diagnosed with breast cancer. And I sort of did the math roughly in my head. If this is the way it is right now, what's it going to be in 3 generations? And that freaked me out. And so I determined, I got to do something, because I don't want that to be our collective future. Of women not able to nourish their children, of women having their breasts removed before they even have children. And so I could sort of see that, and I thought, I have to do something. And the third piece was I was aware that we're not the only mammals. And there were whales, there were polar bears, there were walruses, there were other mammals, there were seals. And I looked at a little bit of that research. They were also getting breast cancer. And I thought, well, who's taking care of them? Where are the hospitals for the whales? Where are the surgeons, you know? Where can they go? And it was all of that together that motivated me to create something. And my vision was, you know, the government's it's not going to come from government. This was 1988. Government's not going to do anything. Policy's going to take a long, long time. The doctors aren't going to do anything. So where's this change going to come from? And the only thing that came to me, it has to be women teaching women. That's the only way it'll work, women teaching women. And so I imagined a revolution of women teaching women, one woman at a time, to another woman, sharing their knowledge and passionately, you know, sharing this information with others so that we could change the future. So that's how it started. And then I developed a Healthy Breast Program. I started teaching that annually, a few times a year. I developed 2 books on breast cancer that were really respected at the time, still are. They've become many women's Bibles. I started working with many, many women with breast cancer from a naturopathic perspective. And then I established the Mamma-Life Foundation so that we could spread this internationally. That's how it all began. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to hit you with another question too. Could you speak to how our health and environmental health are interconnected? What's the relationship between the two?
Well, where do we come from? We come from the air, the water, the soil, the earth. So everything that's in the environment is in our bodies. And as Anna-Liza said, in terms of environmental chemicals, those tend to be stored primarily in our fat cells. So everything that's in the environment eventually moves through the life cycle. You know, it gets into the plants, and then the animals that eat the plants accumulate it, and then the animals that eat the animals that eat the plants accumulate more, And then if we eat the animals that eat plants, that have the contaminated soil, then we become the repository for those environmental chemicals. And those environmental chemicals are coming from the air, they're coming from the water, they're coming from the soil, they're coming from our food. So as long as something is in any of those environments, it's going to come through us. And so we, as somebody said earlier in the earlier panel, we have to see ourselves in relationship to the earth, and we're not separate from anything that happens anywhere else. So if there is degradation of a species or degradation of a lake or air pollutants, all of that is obviously affecting us. And because, especially with these environmental chemicals, they persist in our bodies, the trouble is they're new. Our livers don't know how to break them down. You know, our bodies aren't meant to break them down. So that's another piece, is we really have to enable our detoxification systems, the liver, the kidney, etc., and the bowel movements and the skin, to be able to both break down and eliminate these, to get them out of our systems. And each generation, there's more and more. So the problem's not going away, it's getting worse. And if we want a healthy future and healthy children, we've got to stop this nonsense now and start by making sustainable products, green products, and decrease consumption, as has already been stated earlier. Sorry. Thank you.
Thank you. Elli, as a mindfulness practitioner, could you speak to the idea of Zen and the art of saving the planet, and what does it mean, and how is it relevant here?
So thank you, and again, a big question. And I've been practicing. I share with this community of what we call engaged or applied mindfulness, which is really looking into the roots of these teachings and this wisdom that has been passed to us from so many generations of folks looking into what does it mean to turn towards suffering, to name it, to care it, and transform it. Maybe a very quick definition. And so the community that I come from with Thich Nhat Hanh and Plum Village recently wrote this book called Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet. We have a copy on our table over there if you want to say hi after. But this beautiful question there, the art of saving the planet. I really like that invitation. And what I think is coming up for me to share in this moment is something, a kind of red thread I've heard all day, starting actually when you started speaking earlier at the very beginning of the welcome, was this kind of proposal or hypothesis that I've heard from every speaker today, that we are not separate from the planet. And when I hear that, I really relate to it, because in our trainings and the teaching of mindfulness, we have this term from Thich Nhat Hanh, interbeing, that we inter-are, and that is at the heart of how we are training our minds in the perspective of mindfulness. And so a question I kind of asked back to all of us this panel, if we have this kind of intellectual hypothesis, we are not separate, we can see that from some of the research, but how do we as a society, as a human family, really take on that view? And I think I see so much of the work, so much of the tension that I see when I'm working with activists or in spaces is there's almost this fight because we're having different conversations. We're in spaces where that's not accepted. I don't know if you would walk into a boardroom for many large organizations, or even into a restaurant in Toronto, and you're like, hey, are you inter-are with the trees and the planet? And so it's an interesting question for me. I keep hearing over and over today, we aren't separate. But even for those of us in this room, how often do we, walk outside and see a tree and take a moment to think about our interconnection? Does our society lend itself to this viewpoint? And so when we talk about Zen and the art of saving the planet, the kind of deep aspiration in that book, in some of the training that we do, is to think about, where is the thought technology? And this exists in so many spaces. I come from the space, this lens where I'm trained in this particular tradition, but so many wisdom traditions have, their own language about this. So you may have your own in this room, and I offer from the place that I'm trained. But I would say, because also mindfulness is this very popular term right now. It's great. I get invited to give lots of talks, but everyone thinks it's something different. And so what I might propose to you for my own scholarship in the field And the reason I'm very interested in mindfulness and bringing it into spaces and being part of these dialogues we're having here is, to me, the tradition of mindfulness that is rooted in Buddhist psychology and these wisdom traditions is interested in how we're training our mind. And it's interested particularly in how that training can include at its heart a non-dualistic way of seeing ourselves and nature. And so I'm very curious how we can bring this in, because I often find myself, in spaces where we have all this information, and yet it isn't being taken up. We're not seeing those changes happen in our society. And so one of the proposals from engaged mindfulness is, in order to make those changes in the world, there's also this kind of collective consciousness change, that we need to have some training to really begin to not see ourselves as separate. And that's a really big challenge. I'll just say, from a kind of scientific nerdy perspective, Newtonian physics and quantum physics both exist at the same time, and it makes it challenging for us as like human beings, because I'm in a body here and you're in a body there, and that's partially true. And just because of that kind of physics, that I'm trapped in this idea of separation. That's how I see the world. And as scientists, we're learning about quantum physics, that at some level, all electrons are interconnected and affect each other from millions of miles apart. And I think a lot of scientists and researchers in this field, we're saying it, but how do we see it? And so for me, Zen and the Art of Saving the Planet is about how might we, I think in concert with the research we're seeing, with these kind of intellectual dialogues we're having, how can we also train ourselves and perhaps our society to start seeing the world in this interconnected way? And so a lot of mindfulness practices are about training that capacity in ourselves. And that is a more complex thing that we would need some time to do. But I think that's really the question I have as a researcher and mindfulness practitioner is, my practice, how does it allow me to stabilize myself enough to really see what's here and maybe accept it, and then also to see that interconnected nature.
Beautiful, thank you. It's a good reminder. Anna-Liza and Dharam, I'm wondering if you could both discuss this question or speak on it. Why is holistic care important for managing multifaceted, potentially environmentally induced health traumas? Why do we need holistic care? Why do we need this conscious connection to self and planet?
Well, holistic care is a very broad area, so that could be emotional care, spiritual care, physical care. Let's start with the physical. In conventional medicine, there's very little that's done around detoxification. How would you get rid of an environmental chemical? We know that we have hundreds of them in our bodies, different types. And so this was one of my big questions at that time. So it's hopeless. How are we going to get rid of these? Until I thought, saunas, we can sweat them out. And it's true, you can sweat them out. So, and way back then, we did a little study among 10 people, not a big study, measured the environmental toxins before, measured the environmental toxins in their bodies after 50 hours of saunas. My daughter was one of them, because I wanted her to have healthy babies, which I now have 2 grandchildren. And we found that there was about a 30% reduction. We measured about 5 different environmental chemicals in the blood after 50 hours of sauna. So that was a wonderful thing. And I, when I was practicing at that time with a lot of patients, some of them that were trying to get pregnant, etc., I was really advising people to do 150 hours of cleansing before they attempt to get pregnant. And I remember one woman did it, she, okay, I did 150 hours, now my husband and I are going to try to conceive, and they did, and I met her a year later at a health show, and she said, here's my baby. And I said, a clean baby, a clean baby. The first clean baby. I was so excited. So that's one piece, is the elimination of those toxins. We can also eliminate, just have 3 bowel movements a day. Take enough fibers, you can have 3 bowel movements a day. Drink 3 liters of purified water a day, whether it's filtered water, as long as it's filtered water. 3 liters of water, 3 bowel movements a day. You're going to eliminate sweat every day a little bit through exercise or through the sauna or sweat lodge, whatever works for you. And then we need to support the liver, because the liver has to break down all of those things. There's a study on a goody mice, and the mice were exposed to bisphenol A. Pregnant female mice were exposed to bisphenol A. And when the offspring were born to those female mice that were exposed to bisphenol A, the offspring looked like a different species. They were obese, and they had a different fur color. Instead of the fur being all white, it was brown and white. Just from the exposure to one environmental chemical in the pregnant female. Then they took those same mice, or a different group of agouti mice, and they gave them N-acetylcysteine to the pregnant mice. N-acetylcysteine is a substance that helps your liver detoxify environmental chemicals. And those mice that were born, and also the bisphenol A was linked to diabetes in the baby mice as they grew up. And when they were given the NAC, the mice were born normal. And so that's a big deal. So then I was giving NAC to all of my pregnant patients. You know, take NAC while you're pregnant, take these supplements to help your liver deal with these environmental chemicals. Be primarily vegetarian if possible while you're pregnant, and don't eat any fish. Because the fish I found in my naturopathic practice, if you have fish even once a month, you have high mercury toxicity, and that's passed on. So most of our body burden is passed on to the first baby, either in utero or through breastfeeding, is passed on in the breast milk. So the biggest thing is to get rid of all that, if you can, before you conceive. So that's one area. There's tons more that we can do, but that's just one little sample of what can be done.
That's a good one. That's a good one. There are so many areas. I'm sorting through my mind, thinking about the various ways to answer this. I want to say something about detox, because you mentioned that. I think it's really important. You know, part of wellness culture, one of the parts I don't like, one of the many parts I don't like, is this idea that maybe if you do a detox, which in the advertising is often defined as you get a detox kit of some kind, and you do this maybe in the spring, maybe you hit it in the fall again, and then you're good to go for the year. So you get this kit 2 times a year, done. So if this is what you're thinking, I have news for y'all. Detoxification is happening all the time. It is happening 24/7 in the body in various different ways. And I consider the liver one of the unsung heroes of the body, for all the reasons that you said. Everything that's coming in, the detoxification process, without getting into it too in depth, is actually fairly complicated, and it has a number of stages. And because it has a number of stages, if something goes a little awry with one of them, it can affect others, right? And some of this is also genetic. So we all know people who have been, drinking their whole life heavily. They've been smoking, they've been partying, there's been substances, they're staying up late, God knows what else, right? They're living into their 90s. They're getting to be over 100. And then there's the other people who they're doing everything right in terms of what we consider right, all the things that you mentioned, for example, right? They're eating well, they're doing all these things, and yet they're passing away very early. Well, why is this? Well, if COVID has shown us anything, showed us a lot of things, it's shown us that we're not all the same, right? From a physiological perspective. And anybody that doubted that before COVID, boy, it's pretty hard to argue against it now. How many people do you know that if you had COVID, their experience differed from yours? How many people do you know that have got COVID multiple times? Or how many people do you know that haven't gotten it once, right? And the people that have gotten it, how many people do you know that have had the exact same symptoms for the exact length of time with the exact same symptom severity, right? Everybody, it's different. And when it comes to detoxification and toxins, that's the same thing. Sometimes part of it is genetics, right? When we talked about the things being passed down, but the actual way that our body detoxifies and the ability that our body has to detoxify can actually be, to a certain extent anyway, genetically put out there. But I want to make sure I'm clear here that genetics is not like a life sentence to say, well, you're born that you detox this way and that's it. There's things that you can do, right? Because there's what you're born with, and then there's how you're actually living. So this gets back to the environment piece. What are you surrounding yourself with? What are you putting in your body? And, certainly I think that's where seeing a naturopathic doctor or another allied healthcare professional can really come in handy, because if you can get a handle on some of these things, kind of get a handle on what your own personal detoxification ability is, and then combine that with some lifestyle advice to help deal with that environment piece, with the recognition that, of course, we cannot avoid all toxins. The best that we can do is try to limit our exposure to those toxins and then support our body the best that we can. Because the thing is, our bodies have innate wisdom. And a lot of the time what we need to do is just give our body the things that it needs, the natural things that it needs, and then just step the heck out of the way and let it do what it needs to do. A couple of those things I would say are getting proper sleep. Boy, this is a big one that so many of us have problems with. A lot of that daily detoxification I happened about, it's happening at night. We're resting in our beds, we're sleeping, but our bodies aren't sleeping. They are super, super busy. Your body has a schedule, and when you don't sleep enough, it just means that there's a whole suite of things that either your body has not had a chance to do at all, or it's had a chance to do pretty badly. And often detoxification is one of those things. And think about it this way. If you have, let's say, a factory, right, and you have a lot of garbage, a lot of waste that needs to be taken out. Let's say that factory keeps operating, whatever it's manufacturing or producing. It's operating, it's producing, but the garbage is not being taken out. What's going to happen, right? Well, the mice, not the ones in the experiment, probably other mice will come upon, there might be disease, there might be all other kinds of bacterial things that will happen. Well, in a sense, that's kind of what's going on, right? So detox is not only about what we're taking in, it's about our ability to get it out, because the longer it sticks around there, right, just like a whole bunch of garbage sticking around in that factory, that's not going to be good for any system, and it's going to get into anything. So as you mentioned, keeping up with the water intake, I started doing this 3 liters of water thing about 2 weeks ago. It's kind of changed my life. Like, I'm not gonna lie, it kind of has. And it's so hard though, right? Because it's like you have to go to the bathroom all the time. Like, oh geez, do I have the time for this? Make the time. Make the time. I challenge each and every one of you. Try for 2 to 3 liters of water in a day. Just try it for like a week. And I guarantee you're going to be feeling different. And you're probably going to be feeling like you can think a little clearer. You're probably going to be having less headaches. And your body's going to thank you. I can guarantee it.
Thank you, Anna-Liza. Elli, could you speak a little bit about, I'm thinking about this theme of detoxing, and I remember when I was in your class and in the middle of a really intense undergraduate degree, that it was very much like a detox from a lot of the other academic courses, mostly because of the embodied element and because of the offering to pause and to think deeply and look at what was going on inside my body. Could you speak a little bit about what that is and how to do that for those of our audience who don't know?
We're right on the same page. I was thinking about a teaching that I'll share in a moment called The 4 Nutriments, which is a mindfulness theoretical framework looking at what we consume, and it flows just from what both of you were saying, which is, again, how are we training our minds? How do we make this mind-body connection? And I'm so interested as we talk about detoxifying to not just think about that as a physiological thing. We're talking about seeing with the eyes of interbeing that things are not separate. And so to also recognize some of the toxins that I take in mindfulness, we have this framework called the 4 Nutriments. It's a top hit when I teach it to physicians. They get really excited about this. And basically, we're looking at recognizing what we consume and how it affects us in our bodies. And it asks us to think about consumption maybe in a broader way than we have. So the 4, very briefly, the first is edible foods. So we all kind of know we eat things and they go into our bodies. So I consume food. We might all agree on that. And then it goes on to propose the second nutriment that is so nutriment is about what is nourishing us. And the second one is they called sense impressions in this framework. And that's recognizing that we consume what we see and what we hear, right? What we take in, what we smell. And so the conversations can be toxic for us, right? What are the environments we're in? What are we hearing? What are the billboards we see? Sometimes I go to this cabin that's off the grid, and the first time I drive back into the city with my partner, and I just, all of a sudden, I'm aware of this consumption of the billboards and the sales and the craving and the thing, and I realize like I'm taking in these toxins of what I see and hear. You know, there may be sometimes places that you go where you hear a kind of conversation and that actually comes into your system. And we can see how stressors also impact how our system is processing, how we are sleeping. Just by a show of hands, who here in this room felt a high level of stress any time in the last week? Okay, the last 48 hours? Yeah, so we're under a lot of stress. And how much of that stress maybe came from something that you heard or saw? An email you read, a text. So we're kind of consuming all the time. We would say we have this framework, you know, your inner cabin, this place that we want to take care of. This is what we're talking about. How are we taking care of the toxins in us? And we are so often opening every window and door, our email, our phones, we're just consuming all the time. The other two, I'll just go through quickly. So we have what we eat is something we consume that affects us, what we hear, what we see. And then also it says the third is we consume our own volition. This is really interesting for folks who are in a field of that we're passionate about, that our volition, our motivation to do in life is something we consume. And in non-dualism, none of these are good or bad, right? We can eat a delicious, I sometimes use, I think I use this in the class, we can think through this like, I love potato chips. And there are ways that I can have a healthy relationship to my consumption and an unhealthy relationship. And so, you know, if I open a whole bag of potato chips and just kind of shove it into my body without thinking about it, I don't always feel well. It's the same thing with what I consume. But there's like a healthy way. I can be like, sometimes. But if I put them into like a bowl thoughtfully, I'm like, here's how many I'm gonna have. I can just like really enjoy the few potato chips I'm eating. And so this framework invites us to think, you know, what are you consuming, say, with your eyes or your ears, social media, the news? And are you opening the bag and just eating the whole thing and not knowing how that toxin is affecting you, just like some of these other pieces that we're not aware? So our volition, our motivation in life, this is what drives us to do research or go into the world and ask these amazing questions, start, you know, these things. How are we consuming that? If I am consuming my motivation in a way that gets me excited to wake up in the morning, but sometimes I know as an academic, I start consuming my volition to get a publication done, or as an undergraduate student to get all my work done, and I start telling myself, you're not good enough, go faster, you can't sleep. And I might start consuming my aspiration to do good in the world in a way that actually is toxic for me. And the last one I'll just say is consciousness, that we consume and what we would say collective consciousness. This is really interesting. Who here, just by show of hands, have you ever walked into a room and been like, ooh, this is a bad vibe? Yeah, we consume it, we walk in. And so again, this interesting thing of how do we look at the world with the eyes of interbeing, that we are not separate. Someone says like, oh, just stay, I'm objective, just stay objective in this meeting where everyone's being, you know, really nasty to each other. No, like you're consuming that collective consciousness. So as we think about detoxifying ourselves, a real invitation, like gently and kindly, the ontology and epistemology of mindfulness is like curiosity and kindness. But I invite you, this challenge of drinking water can also be this challenge I'll pose to you of, you know, thinking about what am I consuming in my life in terms of my sense of beyond food, and how does that affect me? And it affects the landscape of our minds, and that is who we are in everything we do. So I'll just say, looking at this is a beautiful thing for yourself, for anyone you work with, and all of our future generations, because when we have the capacity to detoxify, then we also have the capacity to kind of show up in the ways we want, to make it through our undergrad, maybe with a little less stress, and to sleep and do all the other things. So that's my next challenge. Drink water and look at what you're consuming beyond edible food.
Thank you very much. Dharam. The Compassionate Inquiry Program, which some of you may be familiar with, was developed by you and Dr. Gabor Mate, and it says in there that it aims to help people recognize the unconscious dynamics that run their lives and how to liberate themselves from these dynamics. Why is this important to addressing not only our own health, but the health of the planet?
Well, unfortunately, most of our actions are unconscious, coming from our conditioning. And here's where the mindfulness comes in, is we have to use our awareness and the capacity to witness with compassionate curiosity not only what's going on in the body, but also what are the beliefs that's driving our behavior. And then really question those, because when we don't, we have what we have in the world right now. And when we do, we recognize that a lot of our unconscious beliefs, unconscious drivers come from trauma, really, which is something that happened to us when we were young that shouldn't have happened to us, or something that did not happen to us that should have happened to us, both in our own childhoods as well as our parents and grandparents, etc., for several generations. And when we have these traumas, a few things happen. One is, if there's no one to talk to, no one to unburden ourselves with at that time, no one to calmly tell us, yeah, this is really hard, but I'm here with you and everything's going to be okay. Then the trauma doesn't complete itself. It stays suppressed in the body. And it'll stay suppressed somewhere physically as sensations. We're suppressing an emotion. And over time, we start to internalize an unhealthy belief, like, I did something wrong, I'm not good enough, I'm bad, I'm unlovable, I don't matter, I'm not important, I'm all alone, I'm not safe. How many of you are familiar with some of those? And our lives go along. We run, those are the beliefs that tend to run our lives. And then we think we have to publish the next scientific paper to be good enough. Or we think we have to buy the new car or 5 dresses to be accepted, right? So instead of recognizing that we're inherently lovable and acceptable exactly as we are, without having to do or be anything else, we start to become somebody else. We get disconnected from that authentic being, the inner being that we really are, that doesn't need to prove itself. It just is. It's perfect the way it is. And that disconnection then is what creates our disconnection from our authenticity, from our body, from our emotions, and from the environment, and from the land, and from the other species. And we start to be wired to kind of validate ourselves somehow through what we do rather than appreciate ourselves just the way we are. So that needs to be healed for anything else to change. And so that's what compassionate inquiry does, is we look at what's going on in the body right now, what are the sensations, what are the emotions, what wasn't expressed, what's the trigger, what are you believing about yourself. And the thing is, this is really hard to do on ourselves, because what we missed when we were children, or our parents missed, was a relational container to hold us, someone or somebody or a tribe to hold our emotions and let us know everything would be okay. And so Galamante says, we're wounded in relationship, we heal in relationship. So what we need is connection with one another. Connection where we can share our vulnerability, where we can feel safe, we don't have to pretend, we don't have to hide. And that's what we're trying to build in Compassion Inquiry as an international community. Really, it's becoming a big, big, big family of people that feel safe with one another. They can share their woundedness, they can share their vulnerability, nobody's going to judge them. They can get underneath these beliefs and recognize they were never true to begin with. And then really question, well, who am I? Who am I? I'm me. That's it. Nothing else I need to be. And so that kind of healing, I believe, needs to be there for everything else to heal. And the trauma, as we know now, is at the root of much mental illness and chronic physical disease. We know now that suicidality, depression, anxiety, cancers, arthritis, chronic degenerative diseases are directly linked to how many traumatic events or adverse childhood events happened to us when we were young. And like the environmental chemicals, it's passed on through generations. That's known as epigenetics. It's not the gene that's passed on, but the little switch that turns a gene on or off is passed on. And also all that can be reversed through healthy connections. So we need to do more of what we're doing right now. Talk to one another, be with one another, person to person, share. And that's how it's here. Thank you.
Beautiful, thank you. I'm wondering, for Dharam or any other panelists, what are some concrete ways we can cultivate a stronger connection to ourselves and to the planet? Little tools we can take home.
I was reminded as you were sharing about a calligraphy that Thich Nhat Hanh wrote, "You are already enough."
Yeah.
And just really taking that in and really relating, like, how do we detoxify ourselves? And this piece of, we do it with connection. We do it by sharing our vulnerabilities. We have a term, sangha, in Sanskrit, which means community. And that this idea that we don't do this work alone, that it can be lighter together, is so important. And so it's beautiful to hear those words. And I was thinking for myself as a scientist, we may be familiar with the term like in and out group distinctions. It's how we kind of say who's in my tribe and who's not. And that this is very damaging for us as a human, collective human family, but also as part of our world, as our collecting living beings family. That, you know, we have a distinction, again, that we said, like, I'm separate from the tree. Like, if you know some of this research, to feel, we use, you know, the word who's in my tribe, or this in and out group distinction. There's a lot of research that shows that, folks, there was one interesting study looking at a picture of a hand that was stabbed with a fake needle, but they were tracking people's brains, and they would put a label next to the hand that would name a major religion. And anyone watching this, their pain networks as humans were built, our pain networks light up when we see someone else in pain. And when people watch these images, the difference of the label, whether it was a label they felt was they were part of the group or not, changed the level of empathetic distress they felt for the hand. It was the same hand every single time. And just one word to say a religion and whether the person identified, even atheists, had more empathy for a hand that said atheist next to it. And so if we do that as humans, like, imagine we could train ourselves, and then I'll share a concrete practice, to see trees in our in-group distinction. You know, sometimes we're asked, like, how can we motivate everyone to save the planet? And Thich Nhat Hanh would say, well, if you see the planet and every living being on it as your family, then you would just naturally already be taking care of it. And so that's what I'm very interested in, is training ourselves to bring in all living beings into our in-group distinctions. And through that, I don't have to do any more work, because that natural piece of us to care for those who are part of our family, if we extend that to all living beings, it's there already. And so there are many practices to cultivate this. One of the ones that I really enjoy, and you can make these up for yourselves. We heard this guided practice that Lauren made up for us, for those of you who were here earlier. One of the practices we have, it's called pebble meditation. Thich Nhat Hanh created it with some young kiddos around 7 years old on the West Coast many years ago. He had them just identify qualities in nature that they could see in themselves, and there was some of this in Lauren's practice. So the practice is you meditate on the ideas of, and the children came up with this: flower fresh, water reflecting, mountain solid, space free. And it's a practice you can do in your own time, where there's lots of guide. You can Google pebble meditation. But the idea is just to take some time to notice these qualities that are in you that can be quite nourishing, to notice that you have the capacity to be solid like a mountain, and to think of that connection with nature. And another one I do, I'll just plant briefly, especially for those of us who are stressed, who I think was everyone in this room. Walking meditation is a really powerful thing to do, and I'll give just the Cole's notes on it, which is we often are running to the future and past in our minds. We're worried about all our projects. And taking a moment to come home to ourselves and to connect with nature can be very healing for ourselves and cultivate this connection to nature. And a simple way to do it is pick one block, either to or from somewhere you go each day, or from your car into the building. So, like, set a low bar for yourself. I don't try and walk all the way. I have a 20-minute commute. I don't try and do the whole thing mindfully. Just one block. And for that one block, see if you can just be in the present. Like, notice the trees. Notice that they're giving you oxygen. Just every day, taking a few minutes to cultivate this other mind. Not the mind of worry, not the mind of projects, but the mind that the trees are giving you oxygen, that you are here living on this planet. And just a small little practice like that can change what's happening internally and start to build up your connection to the world around you. So something to play with. Pick a low bar and see if you can really be with it and notice like some awe for like the miracle of being alive and all the living things that are around you. And in this little way, you can dose out building these neural connections for the whole planet being your in-group.
Well said, well said. You know, I think myself, coming from a Hindu tradition on one side of my family and a Roman Catholic tradition on another side, I tend to resonate more with the Hindu teachings that I've received. And in those, because reincarnation is a thing in Hinduism, basically, you live a lifetime, you do whatever you're going to do, you're racking up your karma, good or bad, and then, you know, the next lifetime, you could roll back as, it could be human, but it could be, gosh darn near anything else, or anyone else is a better way to put it. Could be a tree, could be a frog. I actually have a list of my top 3 animals that I'd like to come back as.
Yes.
A Stella sea eagle is number 1, by the way, if anyone's curious. And, you know, there's something about having this type of, you know, worldview, this type of cosmology that naturally lends itself, right, to what you're talking about. So I actually feel like what I've had to do in my life is to, I don't know, assimilate, I suppose, is come closer to what everybody else thinks. Because I already naturally think that way. But I've always felt it was not acceptable in this society. When I was a kid, my parents would get so frustrated with me. I would do these things, like I always saw even living things, even inanimate objects, I always saw them as just basically the same as myself. I would do this thing that drove my parents crazy, which is, as a kid, whenever I saw a commercial for a thing, if we had that product in the house, I would run and get it and bring it to the TV. Because I'd be like, if someone did a commercial about me, you know I'd love to see that. Right? You know I'd love to see it. And then, of course, I would, you know, my mom would come back and be like, why are there like 5 products? And I was like, well, the commercial was on, and I thought it would come back, you know. So I'm the kind of person, I'm talking to animals, I'm talking to plants, like just constantly, right? It's very gratifying. I recommend it. And I feel like, you know, now people, it's becoming a little more acceptable. It was not when I was young. I had to do this real on the down low, be like whispering my conversations with these beloved animals and plants. But you know, I think that we have a basic lack of nature literacy in this society. And that is one, but not the only, but that is one reason that I think it's a little bit harder for us to see the vast number of things we have in common with our relations, you know, with our kinship, with our allies. And here's a tip. There's a reason that in the environmental field, some people are called nature interpreters. And that term is actually quite accurate because what these folks are actually doing is helping you, it's like a language, right? They're helping you interpret what you're seeing. So, as in your example, right? If you were to take a walking meditation and maybe take like a small part of that walk, I'll add something else to that. Don't want to do too much for one walk or one block. But even if you don't know much about trees, for example, we all know some basics, right? Like for example, in this climate, we know that in the fall, the leaves are going to turn lots of cool colors and they're going to drop, and then there's going to be no leaves for the winter, and then they're going to come on back. And then when they come on back in the spring, those fresh new leaves are that beautiful green that you never see again for the rest of the year. We know all this intuitively, right? But what would it mean to have a deeper knowing of what's happening, right? Here's something that I personally do. I live in the East End of Toronto here near Broadview and Danforth, and I like to take walks, and I have my favorite trees in the neighborhood. And you know I'm checking on those trees, you know, like throughout the year. So for example, birch trees are one of my favorite trees to look at in the spring. They have a green that's so delightful. There's a fuzziness that takes place, and you blink and you miss it, right? So it's kind of like we have these limited opportunities to see these things. And also when you're observing, whether it's trees, whether it's certain animals, whether it's certain waterways, whatever it is, or whoever it is, think about what you're seeing seasonally. That's something we all have in common. We all live according to the seasons and the natural rhythms, right? So in the same way that, for example, at this time of year, evergreens aside, deciduous trees have dropped their leaves and they're in their dormant period, are we too, as humans, not in some manner of dormancy at this time of year? Do we not have some equivalent of dropping our leaves to conserve energy? And when spring comes back, Do we not have some version of those beautiful fresh green leaves? Do we not have a certain vigor, a certain energy that perhaps is seasonally based? So just think about this. If there's nothing else to connect us to all of the nature that not that we are surrounded by, but that we are part of, then think about how we move through the seasons together, and think about what commonalities we have with all of our allies. Good place to start.
Thank you both. I'll add one more, which is working with the breath. So this sense of connection that we feel with one another and the safety that we can feel with one another occurs when our vagus nerve is activated, and there's something called polyvagal theory. It would be the front or the ventral portion of the vagus nerve is activated. And that allows us to feel in relationship to one another and that connection. We only feel that when we feel safe. So there's a possibility that we can create that safety within ourselves using the breath. So if you slow your breathing down to 6 breaths per minute, your ventral vagus will become activated and you'll become calm and peaceful. And then you're with somebody else, they'll become calm and peaceful because you're calm and peaceful. There's lots of different ways to turn on this ventral vagus, but that's one, just using your breathing. And so right now, how about everybody just slow your breath down a little bit. Fill the belly first, push the belly out as you breathe in. And then fill the chest, expand the chest. And keep inhaling now all the way up to your collarbones. Really slow. So you're sipping the breath in, and then when you're ready, exhaling it out through the nose. First exhale down from your collarbones, your chest, and then pull the belly in a little bit. And then take a little brief pause, 2 or 3 seconds, and notice the stillness of the mind in that pause. In that pause, your mind becomes very quiet. And when you're ready, take another inhale, push the belly out, keep filling it up, expand your chest, keep inhaling all the way up to your collarbones. Pause for a couple seconds, go into stillness, and then slowly exhale. And now do a couple more of these just quietly by yourself at your own pace, but slowing your breath down a little bit. And feel the breath, observe it, hear it, be with it. Now with this awareness on your own breath, imagine you can feel into the breathing of all of us, as though we're one organism breathing together. And a couple more breaths, and now add this flavor of care, compassion, and feed that into this group field. Appreciation for being and being here together. And now take that in from everybody. You're appreciated. Accept that compassion and care that's in the field for each of us. And one more breath in. One more breath out. Thank you. It's like a big hug.
I don't think I have any more questions. This is perfect. Thank you all so much for sharing your wisdom and your space with us and for being here. And thank you, audience, too.